Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In case you're new here, my name is Laura and I'm a PhD student of Comparative Literature in Germany. And this is my series on fantasy and science fiction literature from ancient times to nowadays. Right now we're in the middle of the medieval period and today we're talking about one of the most famous European legends, the Nibelungenlied, the most famous literary adaptation of the Nibelungen saga, which is a German and Norse mythological tale. And there's many versions, but the Nibelungenlied, or the Song of the Nibelungs in English, is the most widely known and the most famous one. It is an epic poem written around 1200 and it tells a story of love, revenge, betrayal, war and many other major themes, and it is a wonderful adventure story. So let's delve right into what's happening. And after giving you the summary of the story, I will also talk about the historical background of the story, the authorship, and the general literary tradition of the Nibelungenlied. So if you're curious, stay tuned and enjoy the video. So we want to start with a summary of the Nibelungenlied. Before we get started, here's a spoiler warning, so if you don't want to know how the story turns out, please skip this part of the video and just jump back in at the part where I'm talking about the historical and literary context. I will link the video chapters below, so you can just skip this part, or you just listen to it and let yourself be guided through the story, through my summary. But this just to know as a spoiler warning before anyone tells me that I've been spoiling their experience of reading. But quickly, another note that I've been finding quite interesting is that the whole epic poem works a lot with foreshadowing and dramatic irony. So basically from the very start you get told that everything's going to end badly, and then in between you have every now and then there's a few lines to just tell, oh, this should be the end of them, or this action should lead to something bad, or he would regret that later, something like that. And that's quite interesting to know. And I will be looking into that in a future video, but just to note that yourself, so the text itself works with loads of spoilers, and when I was reading that at first I was like, hey, please just don't tell me about that, I want to find that out myself. So that was quite interesting to learn. So yeah, let's just get started with the summary. So the Nibelungenlied is divided into 39 adventurous or adventures. They are chapter-like narrative sections. And after that, there's also the Lament that tells what happens after the events of the Nibelungenlied. So let me get started. So in the beginning, Princess Kriemhild is introduced. She's the most beautiful woman far and wide, and she grows up at the Burgundian court in Worms. Worms is a city located at the river Rhine in Germany, and she's under the guardianship of her brothers, the King Gunther, Gernot and Giselher. The brothers rule together, but Gunther, as the eldest, has the precedence. One night, Kriemhild dreams that she is training a hunting falcon that is being torn apart by two eagles. Her mother Ute interprets the dream for her. She says the falcon represents a noble man. If God does not protect him, Kriemhild will lose him early. So in reaction to that, Kriemhild rejects any idea of a relationship or marriage with any person. And then the setting changes to Prince Siegfried, who is the son of the King of the Netherlands, Siegmund and Sieglinde, and he grows up in Xanten. He decides to woo Kriemhild and rides to Worms with a few companions as he's heard of her overall wonderful beauty, and he wants to woo her. So the people there at the court of the Burgundians wonder who the foreign hero might be that arrives. And then Hagen von Tronje, a relative and vassal of the king's, recognizes Siegfried and tells the lords about his glorious deeds. As Siegfried won the enormous treasure of the Nibelungens in battle, as well as the sword Balmung and the invisibility cap, a cloak that makes its wearer invisible and gives him the additional strength of 12 men. But not only that, Siegfried slew a dragon, he bathed in his blood, and in the process acquired a skin made of horn that makes him invulnerable. They are very impressed and invite Siegfried to live at the court. Siegfried lives as a guest at the court for a whole year without seeing Kriemhild ever, and therefore also without bringing forward the suit. He thinks constantly of her, and she secretly observes and admires him. So the love story is already being prepared in a way. But then a declaration of war arrives from the kings Ludeger of Saxony and Ludegast of Denmark. Siegfried goes to war with the Burgundian army and leads it to victory. He has been offering his help to King Gunther, and he has been accepting this offer gladly as he knew about Siegfried's great strength. At the victory festival, Siegfried and Kriemhild meet for the first time. And Siegfried stays in Worms for a longer time and is now allowed to see Kriemhild every single day. So they are in love with each other and really want to get married. Then the setting switches soon again. So across the sea in Iceland, Queen Brunhild reigns. She is not only beautiful but also exceptionally strong. Anyone who wants to win her as his wife must defeat her in a competition. He must throw a spear and a stone further than her. If he fails, he has forfeited his life. But King Gunther is determined to take the risk. Siegfried, who is familiar with the conditions in Iceland, initially advises against it, because he knows that it is close to impossible to conquer Queen Brunhild. When Gunther promises him Kriemhild's hand, he is willing to help with the courting nonetheless. Accompanied by Hagen, the vassal of the king, and his brother Dankwart, they sail across the sea. As they approach Iceland, they agree on a ruse on Siegfried's advice. Siegfried will pretend to be Gunther's vassal. To demonstrate his subordinate status, Siegfried holds Gunther's horse by the bridle when they land. Brunhild and her women watch the scene from the castle. Nevertheless, Brunhild thinks Siegfried is the courting man and greets him in front of the others, so this plan has not worked out entirely. He refers her to Gunther still. He takes part in the combat games and only carries out the birth, while Siegfried, hidden under the invisibility cap, performs the deeds. Thus, Brunhild is defeated, as Siegfried is as strong as 13 men in total. She surrenders and calls for her relatives and followers. They appear in such large numbers that the courting men become suspicious. To get help, Siegfried sails to the Nibelungenland, where the dwarf Alberich guards the treasure for him that he's been acquiring before when he's been defeating the Nibelungs. He calls together 1,000 warriors and returns with them to Iceland. But they are not even needed, as Brunhild is ready to follow Gunther to Worms, as he has defeated her in the competition. Siegfried is sent ahead as a messenger and reports in Worms that the courtship has been successful. So the court prepares for the arrival of the new queen, and the returning couple is received with great pomp. At the evening banquet, Siegfried demands the agreed price, that he will get Kriemhild's hand in marriage. So Kriemhild is sent for and is married to Siegfried on the spot. They are both very happy, but Brunhild, who must think Siegfried is not an equal, bursts into tears because of the supposed misalliance between Kriemhild and Siegfried, as she thinks still that Siegfried is the vassal of King Gunther, so he cannot be equal to Kriemhild, who is the sister of Gunther. So nobody explains anything to Brunhild at this point. And at night, Gunther wants to consummate the marriage with her, but she refuses, as she feels very suspicious and as if she doesn't know what's really going on around her. Nobody really tells her anything. So, as she is far superior in strength, she ties him up with a belt and hangs him on a nail on the wall. And he has to stay on the wall for the whole night until the next morning. She's taking him down, but telling him never to touch her again. The next day, he complains of his suffering to Siegfried, and the latter has a plan again. He promises to help him once more, and the next evening sneaks into Gunther and Brunhild's bedroom under the invisibility cap again. Gunther turns out the lights. Siegfried lies down next to Brunhild and wrestles the reluctant woman to the ground. So this whole scene is very horrific and violent, so if you don't want to read it, then you should maybe just skip that. While he is holding her, Gunther deflowers her. From then on, she is no stronger than any other woman. Siegfried takes her ring and belt and leaves the room. The wedding celebrations can continue after that. And Brunhild is defeated by Gunther once and for all. When the festival of the marriage, the double marriage celebrations, is over, Siegfried and Kriemhild move to Xanten, to the home of Siegfried, and he takes over the rule from his father. An heir to the throne is born in both Worms and Xanten. Siegfried and Kriemhild's son is called Gunther, and Gunther and Brunhild's son is called Siegfried, and this way they also show their close attachment to each other. Brunhild becomes increasingly suspicious that the supposed vassal Siegfried does not serve the court in Worms, because this is just not how it's supposed to be. So she convinces Gunther to invite Siegfried and Kriemhild to a festival to find out more. And the invitation is accepted pretty soon. Accompanied by the father Sigmund, Siegfried and Kriemhild move to Worms with a large entourage, where they are given a splendid reception, once again. When Brunhild and Kriemhild watch the men's fighting games during the festivities, a scandal ensues. In a heated debate, Brunhild insists that Siegfried is subordinate to her husband Gunther, while Kriemhild declares him to be equal, even superior. The private argument is followed by a confrontation in public. That is one of the most heated scenes in the whole epic poem. The queens and their entourages meet in front of the Münster, the cathedral, when they go to church. Brunhild harshly demands that Kriemhild let her go first in as the one of higher rank. So this is just very important. The first one to go is the one that is supposedly the higher rank. But Kriemhild comes up with a trump card. It was Siegfried, not Gunther, who slept with Brunhild first, she says. Brunhild bursts out into tears, and Kriemhild walks past her with her women into the cathedral. So in that moment she appears as the triumphant figure in that fight. But after the mass, Brunhild publicly confronts Kriemhild. She must prove what she has claimed. And Kriemhild then shows Brunhild a ring and a belt, which Siegfried had given her after spending the night at Brunhild and Gunther's chamber, as she's been sneaking these items out as a symbol of his own triumph, basically. And then things get a little complicated because everyone's been accusing. Obviously, Kriemhild has been telling a lie to Brunhild, as Siegfried has not really been sleeping with Brunhild, but Kriemhild lets Brunhild believed this so that she can triumph over the whole situation. But as she's been telling a lie, she has also been misusing the trust of Siegfried, and Siegfried is also accused by Gunther. So everything's getting quite mixed up here now. So Gunther then calls Siegfried, who is immediately ready to swear that he never boasted about being Brunhild's first husband. And it is not clear from the depiction whether Siegfried actually swears or whether Gunther exempts him from the oath, so that remains free to interpretation. But the matter seems to have been settled. But Hagen is determined to avenge Brunhild's disgrace. And this is a very major figure. Hagen is always intervening, and Hagen is the villain of the story, as you will realize pretty soon. So Hagen goes to Brunhild and promises her that he will avenge this disgrace. Siegfried is to be killed. And he succeeds in persuading Gunther to support the murder plan eventually. So they fake a new declaration of war by the kings Ludeger and Ludegast that we've had before. And as expected, Siegfried agrees to help again in the battle. So he's getting ready for fight, basically, but Kriemhild fears for his life and asks Hagen to protect him. She tells him that the cornea between his shoulder blades, so there's one spot, has a hole because a linden leaf fell there when he was bathing in the dragon's blood that he's been slaying before the whole events of the Nibelungenlied even started to happen. And this is the only vulnerable spot in his whole body. And Kriemhild marks it with an embroidered cross on Siegfried's robe, believing that this way Hagen is able to protect Siegfried by all means, because he knows of this one vulnerable spot. But Hagen is making use of this for his own good. So he is convinced that the sign is in place and sends false messengers to announce that the declaration of war has been withdrawn because he's got everything from Kriemhild that he needs right now. So instead of the campaign, Gunther organizes a hunt in the forest. Kriemhild is once again warned by bad dreams. She begs Siegfried to stay away from the hunt, but he does not let himself be held back and proves to be by far the most successful hunter. When they sit down to eat after the hunt, he misses the wine because there's no wine delivered and he wonders why. And he gets thirsty. Hagen, who claims to have sent the wine to the Spessart, the forest, by mistake, directs the thirsty hunters to a nearby spring and suggests that Siegfried, Gunther and him could make a race to the source. Siegfried agrees and is the first to reach the finish line as expected, but waits carefully until the king has come and drunk himself. When Siegfried then bends over the water himself, Hagen shoots his spear through his back at the indicated spot that Kriemhild has been pointing out with a small cross, stitching on his cloak. As he dies, Siegfried orders Kriemhild's brothers to protect her. And Hagen has the dead man laid in front of the door of Kriemhild's chamber, where a chamberlain discovers him in the morning. And Kriemhild accuses Hagen immediately of murder, as if she's known everything. Those involved deny this and claim that robbers killed Siegfried. But when Hagen steps up to the bier, the dead man's wounds bleed again, which is seen as a very clear sign of him being revealed as the murderer. So Siegfried is buried with great pomp. And after that, Siegmund, the father of Siegfried, returns to Xanten, but Kriemhild stays in Worms. And she mourns for 3.5 years without speaking a word to Gunther or without seeing Hagen, as she's very bitter, full of hatred. And Hagen wants the Nibelung treasure to come to Worms and persuades Gunther to reconcile with Kriemhild, which he is successful at in a way. Kriemhild has the treasure, which was her morning gift, brought from the Nibelungenland, and uses it to bind foreign heroes to her with rich gifts in these 3.5 years. And Hagen sees this as a danger for Siegfried's murderer, and then takes the treasure from Kriemhild and sinks it in the Rhine. This is how the first part of the story ends. And the second part picks up 13 years after the murder. So in Aventure 20, Helge, the wife of the mighty Hun king Etzel, had died. On the advice of his loyal followers, Etzel decides to ask for Kriemhild's hand in marriage and sends Margrave Rüdiger von Bechelaren to Worms as a suitor. The kings agree to the union, although Hagen strongly advises against it. Kriemhild initially refuses the union, but Rüdiger manages to change her mind, and she is tempted by the prospect of being able to avenge Siegfried's murder with the power of being a Hun queen. She travels with Rüdiger to the land of the Huns very soon. Giselher and Gernot, her brothers, accompany the procession to the Danube. Bishop Pilgrim of Passau, one of Ute's brothers, rides to meet Kriemhild, leads her to a city and accompanies her for a good part of the way east. On the so-called Thronfield, Etzel receives his future wife. The wedding is celebrated in Vienna, and then the couple travels on to Hungary. From then on, Kriemhild rules with great power at Etzel's side. And they soon also have a son who is called Ortlieb. After 7 years, Kriemhild considers her position so secure that she thinks she can take revenge finally. She asks Etzel to invite her relatives from Worms. The minstrels Werbel and Schwemmel are to deliver the invitation. They ride via Bechelaren in Passau to Worms. Against Hagen's advice, the invitation to travel to the Huns is accepted. The messengers travel back via Passau and Bechelaren and tell Kriemhild that the Burgundians are coming. The Burgundians, who are now also called Nibelungs, as they are the ones having the Nibelung treasure in a way, that is a little bit complicated, set off with a troop of 1,000 armed knights. On the 12th morning they reach the Danube. While searching for a ferryman to take them across, Hagen meets 2 water women who predict that of the Burgundians only the king's chaplain will return. Hagen finds the ferryman, kills him in a fight, and ferries the Burgundians across in the slain man's boat. To test the truth of the prophecy, he throws the chaplain into the water. When he reaches the starting bank, although the chaplain cannot swim, Hagen knows that there is no turning back, so they are basically traveling into their own death, into their own destiny. So notified of the ferryman's death, the Bavarian counts Else and Gelfrat pursue the Burgundians with an army. They are defeated by the rear guard under Hagen's leadership. Gelfrat falls at Dankward's hand, and at the border of Rüdiger's domain, the Burgundians come across a sleeping knight. It is Margrave Eckewart, a confidant of Kriemhild. He warns Hagen of her hatred and then rides ahead to Bechelaren to report the arrival of the Burgundians. Rüdiger and his wife Gotelind receive them with great hospitality. Rüdiger's daughter is betrothed to Giselher. And when they leave, the Burgundians receive valuable gifts. Hagen asks Gotelind for a shield that her relative Nudung once carried. Rüdiger leads the Burgundians to Etzel's residence, where Kriemhild watches their arrival from a window. Dietrich von Bern, who lives in exile at the Hun court, greets and warns the Burgundians. Kriemhild goes to meet them, provocatively greets only the youngest brother Giselher, who is not to blame for Siegfried's death, and gets into an argument with Hagen almost immediately. Even before Etzel is greeted, there is another confrontation. Hagen and his friend Volker, who is famous for his violin playing and singing and is therefore called the Fiddler, sit down on a bench in front of the building where Kriemhild resides. She approaches the two with a group of armed men who are supposed to kill Hagen. They remain seated provocatively. Hagen puts Siegfried's sword over his knee and confesses to the murder in front of Kriemhild. Kriemhild calls in vain on the Hun warriors to avenge the murder, and Etzel receives the Burgundians himself. The following night, Hun warriors approach the hall where the Burgundians are sleeping. The planned attack fails due to the vigilance of Hagen and Volker, who remain wide awake for the whole night. At church the next morning, the Burgundians appear in full armor on Hagen's advice, instead of just wearing their festive clothes. Volker deliberately kills a Hun in the following tournament, but Etzel prevents his men from avenging the murder and pretends that nothing has happened because he wants to keep the peace. Kriemhild is able to win over Etzel's brother Blödelin to her plan of revenge. They sit down for a meal in Etzel's hall. Dankwart dines with 12 knights and 9,000 squires in another hall, and Blödelin attacks them with 1,000 men. The Huns slaughter the knights and squires. Dankwart kills Blödelin and fights his way to the hall where the feast is taking place. Covered in blood, he steps under the door and calls to Hagen what has happened. Hagen tells him not to let any Huns out and hits the head of a little Ortlieb, the son of Kriemhild and Etzel, and his tutor, and the right hand of the minstrel Werbel. A fight ensues in which the Burgundians defeat hordes of Huns, so basically a massacre is carried out. Dietrich von Bern and his men, Etzel, Kriemhild and Rüdiger are able to leave the hall in which the Burgundians are entrenched. The Burgundians throw the dead and wounded Huns out of the hall. Kriemhild offers gold, lands and cities for Hagen's head, so she is very, very devastated and desperate to get him killed. Erwing von Denmark dares to attack Hagen and is killed. The Huns storm the hall in ever new waves of attacks. Finally, Kriemhild has the building set on fire. The heat and smoke take their toll on the Burgundians. They quench their thirst with the blood of the fallen. The next morning, Rüdiger appears at the scene. Although he is obligated to the Burgundians, he must fight against them as Etzel's vassal. At Hagen's request, he gives him his shield as a replacement for Nudung's shield, which has been smashed. In return, Hagen and Volker renounce their right to fight with him. In a fierce battle, all of Rüdiger's men lose their lives. He and Gernot, the brother of Gunther, kill each other. Dietrich of Bern's men who intervene in the fighting also fall. Only Hildebrand, Dietrich's old weapon master, survives. Of the Burgundians, only Gunther and Hagen are still alive. Dietrich wrestles them down and hands them over to Kriemhild. She demands that Hagen hand over the treasure. He refuses, citing an oath that he and the kings had once sworn, that neither of them would reveal the hiding place of the treasure as long as one of the others was still alive. Kriemhild has Gunther beheaded and shows Hagen the severed head after that. He triumphs. Now only he knows where the hiding place is, and he will not give it away. Then Kriemhild tears Siegfried's sword from its scabbard and cuts off his head. But old Hildebrand will not accept this and deals her a fatal blow with his sword. So she dies too. And this is how the story ends. And if you want to know what's happening after that, there's the Lament, which is included in almost all complete manuscripts, and it is a continuation in Paris. It should be divided into 3 parts. After a short prologue, the narrator recapitulates the events from Siegfried's murder to Hagen and Kriemhild's death. He gives further details about the battles and excuses Kriemhild, who only acted out of love for Siegfried and is therefore not to be blamed. Then it is told how the noble dead are laid out and buried amid loud lamentations from the survivors. One by one, the bodies of Kriemhild and the great heroes are found. Etzel, Dietrich and Hildebrand recapitulate and comment on the events. Etzel is beside himself with pain. He sees the catastrophe as a punishment from God for his apostasy from Christianity. Etzel sends messengers to inform the world of the catastrophe. Schwemmel is sent to Brünnhild in Worms. He sets off with Rüdiger's squires. When they arrive in Bechelaren, they try to conceal the fact that Rüdiger is dead, but the truth cannot be suppressed. Rüdiger's wife and daughter faint from pain. Schwemmel's further journey takes him via Passau. Bishop Pilgrim asks him to inform him of the events and sends messengers to Etzel's court to question other eyewitnesses. In Worms, Schwemmel reports to Brünnhild and the greats of the country in the presence of Crown Prince Siegfried. Ute, Kriemhild's mother, dies of pain and is buried in Lorsch. The young Siegfried is made a knight and crowned. The Burgundian kingdom has a king again. Schwemmel travels back. Dietrich leaves Etzel's kingdom with his fiancée Harald and Hildebrand to return to his ancestral land. This is a heavy blow for Etzel, who loses his mind over it. The narrator knows that there are different opinions about Etzel's further fate, but nothing is known for sure. Dietrich, Harald and Hildebrand stop off in Bechelaren on their journey. Rüdiger's wife has since died. Dietrich promises her daughter that he will marry her off appropriately. An epilogue follows which reports that Bishop Pilgrim, out of love for his nephews, commissioned his scribe Conrad to record the events in Latin based on eyewitnesses' accounts. Before we talk about the literary and historical context, let me quickly give you an overview of the origin and tradition and also the manuscripts of the Nibelungenlied, because that's quite interesting to know if you want to get into reading it for yourself. So, as I mentioned before, the Nibelungenlied was probably written precisely around 1200, so between the late 12th and the very early 13th century, on behalf of the Bishop of Passau, Wolfgang von Erla, at his court. And there's approximately 37 mostly fragmentary German manuscripts and one Dutch version of this epic poem. Among these, two manuscripts only contain the Klage, the Lament, and one includes an Aventurenverzeichnis, or list of adventures. The manuscripts were predominantly found in the southern German-speaking regions Switzerland, Vorarlberg and Tyrol. And the three oldest complete manuscripts, which are considered the primary witnesses to the text, are labeled as follows. A is the Hohenems Munich manuscript, that is in the Bavarian State Library from the late 13th century. B is the St. Gallen manuscript from the mid-13th century or slightly earlier in the Abbey Library of St. Gallen. And C is Hohenems Lasberg, the Donaueschingen manuscript from early 13th century, which is since 2001 in the Baden State Library. So A, B and C are the three main important manuscript versions, and they are seen as representative of three different versions of the text, and their relationship remains largely unresolved until today. In 2009, all of the three manuscript versions were declared UNESCO World Documentary Heritage. And alongside these three main manuscript traditions, there is also believed to be a significant oral tradition, though its influence on the written text is difficult to assess. So the manuscripts are grouped according to their final verse. Manuscript A and B end with Das ist der Nibelungen Not. That is the downfall of the Nibelungens in English. And these versions are called the Notfassung, the downfall version. Manuscript C and its variants end with Das ist der Nibelungenlied. That is the song or epic of the Nibelungs, known as the Liedfassung or song version. The C version became the most widespread and was mostly written with regard to the readership, with several manuscripts offering nearly the same text. These are grouped under the label C. Some, though few manuscripts, offer a text nearly identical to B, and they are grouped under B. I myself have been reading the B version, or one of the B versions, but I guess you're generally free to read whatever version you feel interested in, or you can read upon more. So that's to know about the 3 different manuscript versions. So A, B, and C, that's basically what you should know if you want to get into reading that. The Nibelungenlied emerged in a time that was seen as a new beginning in literature, because it is one of the main works of the so-called courtly literary period between 1170 and 1230, which is often referred to as the classics of medieval times or medieval literature, analogous to Weimar classicism. And the idea of an epochal turning point in the second half of the 12th century does not only arise from the historical perspective of the modern era, but the new beginning was already self-consciously perceived and commented on in that time in the 12th and 13th century, which is quite interesting to know, I think. And for the medieval literary critic, the innovation of the literary period lies in the adoption of the love theme into literature, the Minnesang, and in the reception of ancient material, but also above all, in the metrically balanced verse art with pure rhymes. So pure rhymes are very important in that literature. And these aspects are still, according to today's judgment, among the characteristics of the newly courtly poetry. And they refer to the new orientation in terms of content, which consists in the turn to secular material and themes compared to the preceding mostly spiritual literature in German. And they concern the formal cultivation of a poetic language with supra-regional tendencies to balance, which stands out from the free verse structure with impure rhymes and many dialectical regionalisms. So these features are seen as the most important ingredients of this courtly literature. And among this genre, this new literary form, the Nibelungenlied stands out for several reasons that I want to mention now, because it's quite interesting. So it was written in this literary and historical context, but unlike the texts of the celebrated authors of the time, the Nibelungenlied cannot be traced back to written sources by the Latin, Roman or German, but it is considered a written version of oral poetic tradition. So that's quite interesting to know, because many of the other works that have been published in that time, like the Eric, the Evine and other works, most of them had works that were preceding them, they were building upon, that were like serving as examples that they could adapt and transform into something new. But for the Nibelungenlied, there was just this oral tradition and several different versions. And another thing that is quite interesting to know is that no author is responsible for the Nibelungenlied with his name. So this is surprising in a time when poets developed personal styles and proudly named themselves also. So usually the poets were proudly presenting their own work and their own name, putting that name onto the work to show that it's their own work and to really state and stress that. So that is, in these two ways, the Nibelungenlied stands out, and it's setting the Nibelungenlied apart from other courtly narrative works and assign it to its own genre in a way, the heroic epic. And it has a few key features. So one is the anonymous transmission of the work. Secondly, the origin of the material from oral tradition with a historical core. And thirdly, the strophic and singable form. So this genre, the heroic epic, which tells stories of heroes from Germanic prehistoric times, is initially represented in literature around 1200 only by the Nibelungenlied. Isn't that interesting? The genre-defining significance of the characteristics I mentioned, the three of them, so the strophic singable form, the origin of the material from oral tradition, and the anonymous transmission of the work, arise from similarities with the so-called Dietrich epic and the Gudrun, both of which are also quite important works. But these works cannot be dated precisely in their written form. They mostly belong to the 13th century, but hardly to the beginning of it. So the Nibelungenlied stands out in that way, in that it was like the earliest work of that tradition in or around pretty precisely 1200 actually. So it is difficult to say to what extent the Nibelungenlied itself already followed rules that had developed in the oral traditions. And this is difficult because of the lack of supporting material to tell anything more, as is usually the problem from when working with such old sources. But one approach that seems to be obvious to scholars is that the Nibelungenlied probably provided the model for the strophic form, while the anonymity of the stories continues oral customs. So the material is based on local historical legends, in contrast to the traditions about King Arthur's knights and the Trojan War, and these are transmitted anonymously in that oral tradition. And at the same time, the Nibelungenlied also provided this strophic song form. So here you see a few examples of why the Nibelungenlied stands out. So it's like one of the first major works of this genre of heroic epic, and it's also standing out as it's coming from the oral tradition, and it has no traceable one single author. So that's quite interesting to know, I think. Also, although the anonymity of the Nibelungenlied's authorship was accepted by contemporaries, scholars have long debated its authorship. Some, like Karl Lachmann for example, proposed multiple songwriters, while others suggest it was common property among singers. The dominant view today attributes the work to an individual, raising questions about their artistic profile, historical context, and possible identity. So the poem's structured composition and transition from oral traditions to a nearly 10,000 verse epic suggests a single artistic mind. Its rapid spread in the 13th century indicates that the poet was well known, yet his name remained unrecorded. Otto Höfler, a scholar, argued that anonymity was a standard feature of heroic poetry, where narrators saw themselves as transmitters rather than creators. However, that does not fully explain why the poet of such a transformative, important work remained unnamed, unlike Hartmann von Auer, Wolfram von Eschenbach, and Gottfried von Straßburg, for example, who adapted existing material but also took credit for that, as I mentioned before. So that's really standing out here. But rather than a question of the name, the poet's status, his education, and social position is more significant because it's telling us more about the work and the writing and the times in total. So understanding the historical context provides a clearer picture of the mind behind the Nibelungenlied, and the mind is more important than the name. So to sum this up, scholars debated the authorship of the Nibelungenlied for a long time now, and the view that is most common or widely spread by now is that they assume it was a single author, and this author must have been well educated and well known as well in that time, but still anonymous. And this person still cannot be traced back. So that's the problem. We cannot really tell, but it's also not so much about the name, but more about what kind of a person would that have been? How was the person educated? Where was the person living and spreading their work? And what does that tell us about the influence and the cultural and literary surroundings? So now that we've been looking at the literary history and the authorship of the Nibelungenlied, I also want to look at the historical background a little bit. So are there historical roots to the Nibelungenlied, and how can this be traced back? Because it's also quite interesting to see. So usually heroic epics have historical roots, and in the Middle Ages this applies to the Nibelungenlied, the Dietrich epics and the Chanson des Gestes, linking German and French literature closely together, so they are often inspiring each other, and connecting them with other heroic traditions as well. So while historical events differ, legends preserve and reshape history through common narrative patterns across the cultures and also intertwine. So one event that is recorded in the Nibelungenlied is the fall of the Burgundians, which reflects a real event from the migration period or the Völkerwanderung. The Burgundians, federates of Rome, sought expansion but were crushed in 436 or 437 AD by the Roman general Aetius with Hunnic allies. So their king Gundahar and much of the tribe perished. Survivors resettled in what is now Savoy, where they adapted to Roman culture. Later, King Gundobad recorded the Burgundian tribal laws, preserving names like Gibica, Gundomaris and Gundaharius, which appear in the Nibelungenlied as Gunther, Giselher and Gernot. So the three brothers from the Burgundian kingdom, they are having these names, and this can be in a way traced back. So that's just one connection to the historical happenings. But other historical figures also inspire other characters. For example, Etzel represents King Attila, the ruler of the Huns, though he was not directly involved in the Burgundians' fall. Dietrich von Bern is based on Theodoric the Great, who ruled the Ostrogoths in Italy and fought Odoacer, the last Roman ruler. If you want to learn more about the Ostrogoth or the Goth in general, I will link my video on what is Goth up here. And the historical basis of the Nibelungenlied's first part is less clear in total. So names and themes suggest links to 6th century Merovingian history, particularly Sigebert of Austrasia's murder, which is mirroring Siegfried's fate. Brunichild and Fredegund, I hope I pronounced that correctly, resemble Brunhild and Kriemhild, though their roles are reversed in that historical event. And some scholars connect Siegfried to Arminius, who defeated Rome in 9 AD, but such theories remain speculative. Unlike the Burgundians' fall, Siegfried's story lacks firm historical grounding, though parallels exist in Frankish intrigue. So basically you can say that the most important connection we have here is that between the fall of the Burgundians and the fall of the Burgundians in the Nibelungenlied, and the names that were connected or taken upon into the narrative. But for the first part, there's just this Merovingian history that could be a trace, but it's not very clear, and I'm not an expert in that at all. So just to let you know, there's people assuming connections, but it's not, you cannot really put your finger on it if that's really what's been meant or what's been like the idea behind it. But as it was the oral tradition, the story might have changed and might have been transmitted from some places to another, and so got changed and developed over time. So it's pretty difficult to trace back where like the origins of this historical context could lie. So this was my video on the summary and historical and literary background of the Nibelungenlied. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you have any questions, please drop them down below in the comments. I will make more videos about the Nibelungenlied because I think it's such an interesting tale. I would like to look in more detail on the different characters and their motivations, and also look at how this epic poem was adapted and how it influenced other works of literature and film in later years. For example, there's the influence on Tolkien and also the influence on the Ring des Nibelungen by Richard Wagner, for example, and other major writings. And it's also closely connected to the poetic Edda, and I will make a video about that as well in the future. But I also want to look at this dramatic irony and foreshadowing, the kind of spoilers that the story is working with so much, and the depiction and the way that the light is shed on the different characters and events. And this is quite interesting to look at in more detail. So if you're interested in that, please stay tuned for the next video in this series on the Nibelungenlied. And thank you for watching and staying till the end if you did. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in my next video. Thank you and bye bye. Have a nice day.